Hello. Okay. Major technical issues. Apologies, everyone. But we are here. Welcome to the Left Lens. Apologies for that beginning. Had some technical issues over this way. But as you can see here, I'm joined by a very special guest. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Left Lens Live. Be sure to hit that like button. Where is everyone at tonight? Where's everyone been at for the last few days? It's a new year. So it has been quite an interesting one for YouTube. But nonetheless, the best way to get people watching this stream is to like it, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notifications bell, and of course, be sure to support this channel in all of the links in the description, Patreon being the best place. You can find that all in the description. But let's get right to it, because as you can see, I am joined by Riley Sung-Yoon Park. He is a member of Nodutdol. He's also edited a great book called Socialist Education in Korea. And he is also a member of the Answer Coalition in PSL. So welcome, Riley. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Of course, of course. So let's get started, because we have a wide-ranging conversation in just about an hour to talk. And so, of course, Nodutdol, I consider it to be the primary source for all things Korea. And recently, we've had pretty intense escalations from the United States toward, surprise, surprise, the DPRK, or what a lot of people know as just North Korea. So I wanted to ask you, Riley, because there have been what's been said in the media, record number of ballistic missile tests, satellite launches by the DPRK. The DPRK has also said that no longer is it going to be privy to negotiations about the nuclear question, which is basically all you hear about in the U.S. media, Western mainstream media, is the DPRK is nuclearizing. We have to denuclearize the DPRK. But I wanted to ask you about these recent U.S. escalations. There's been fighter jets sent to F-22 fighter jets sent to the south, and rumors that the United States was going to engage in nuclear exercises with South Korea, which has more than 10,000 U.S. troops, and of course conducts regular military exercises there against the DPRK. So could you talk about these recent escalations, and where do you see this fitting into the history of Korea, and where do you see this also going from here?
Yeah, great question. Well, first, I guess we'll start with the I think the most glaring answer is, like, for the past couple of years, the United States has been ramping up aggression towards the DPRK and also China as well. And these types of developments, have been in the works for many, many years now. As some people know, or maybe not know, in 2018, you had the talks between the Trump administration, right, and South Korean President Moon Jae-in, and then DPRK Chairman Kim Jong-un. However, the Trump administration ultimately had failed to honor the commitments towards the DPRK, and with that, relations have kind of further deteriorated from that. As you mentioned, the war jets, the military exercises. As we know, this past summer, the United States military has been conducting military exercises in the Pacific, known as RIMPAC. RIMPAC is, an annual event that happens every spring, every summer. The United States and South Korea, hold these exercises twice every year or so, right? However, this past summer, these have been the most frequent and the largest exercises since 2017, or sorry, 2019. 2017, 2018. And now we're seeing with South Korean President, Yoon Suk-yeol, we're seeing, an increased amount of U.S. militarism, on the peninsula. While, Moon Jae-in also kind of increased militarism and investment into, ROK U.S. military. Yoon is a little bit more explicitly pro-U.S. and anti-DPRK, very similar to Trump in the way of being more explicit with like, oh, this is what we're gonna do, that sort of thing. So, and Yoon kind of promises to take more of a war hawkish approach towards U.S. or towards relations with the DPRK, but he also promises more cooperation with Japan. So yeah, we're just seeing a lot happen within a short time, but also these have kind of like been going on for a while now.
Yeah, and the DPRK is often called this like hermit kingdom, and it's always spoken about in the Western mainstream media as basically a pariah state. And I wanted to get your analysis of why the U.S. is so hostile, and then you can also add in the U.S.'s I would call it a client state in South Korea, given that I believe the U.S. still has the ability to assume leadership over South Korea's military if there is kind of a wartime situation. Japan also just passed this massive military budget. I think doubled its military budget in contravention of its own constitution, and a lot of that was in relation to China. But Japan also cited the DPRK, and there was news stories across the Western media talking about how the DPRK had basically launched a missile over Japan, and so why is the DPRK why is the DPRK framed as a pariah state, and what is the DPRK building up for? Like, why? Because I don't think that many people in the United States or the West in general really understand the situation that is being presented to them because of the way that the Western corporate media, completely just distorts the whole situation. So could you talk about that?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think with the DPRK, especially, the DPRK's socialist system, social and economic system, socialism, remains antithetical towards capitalism and imperialism, right? And so, the relationship or the diplomatic relationship between China and the DPRK historically has threatened and continues to threaten U.S. interests in the region. So, the DPRK is one of the most demonized countries in the world by, Western countries in of the media. Part of that demonizing any kind of alternative social and economic system, demonizing socialism, right, is part of a legacy of Cold War propaganda. Um, Another important, reason is that there is a South Korea, right? The hegemonic narrative relies heavily on this sort of binary, right, between a North and South Korea, between a good and bad Korea, right? To the Western media, there's a good Korea and then there's a bad Korea. Um, so the U.S. needs to demonize North Korea and needs an evil Korea so that it can have a reason to occupy and control South Korea. If North Korea wasn't so demonized, if to the U.S., if they weren't so evil, the U.S. military would have no reason to be on the Korean Peninsula. And so, and, to extend this, this could be said of China or Russia or Cuba or any supposed quote unquote enemy of freedom and democracy. If we didn't, if the U.S. didn't demonize these quote unquote supposed enemies, the U.S. military would not be needed. And so, and this carries a very long history of U.S. imperialism on the peninsula, right? Um, so as some know, the U.S. had never ended the Korean War. It still goes on to this day. The initial armistice that was signed in 1953 basically was just like a ceasefire. So that didn't really just, there was no peace treaty or anything like that. And so, so then, the United States continues to occupy South Korea to this day, had propped up military dictatorships supported by the United States up until the late 80s. Even after the military dictatorships ended in the late 80s, we still see U.S. influence, right? Kind of the bolstering of U.S. cooperation with South Korea. The South Korea doesn't control its own military, right? It's all in the joint of the U.S. military. There's a free trade agreement. I believe that any corporation, any U.S. or Western corporation, but mostly U.S., basically can circumvent South Korean law, and can do whatever they want in that regard. The economy is heavily based on cooperating with the United States and other Western countries, but mostly the United States. And then you also see, this you see you also see the corporations in the South, right? The chaebols, conglomerates that kind of heavily benefit from having the United States, because it bolsters their own exports and stuff like that, and their own interest in that sort of neo-colonial relationship between South Korea and the United States. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely what sounds like a real consortium, a real just multifaceted set of interests that the United States has on the Korean Peninsula, and the DPRK seems to represent the antithesis of those interests. And you know, I wanted to get into the DPRK more so because we had a Nodutdol member, Janice, on, and we talked a lot about the propaganda. People should check that episode out from earlier last year. We talked a lot about the propaganda of the DPRK, the distortions, the whole defector industry. And what I wanted to speak more about, now that we have some of the context of this aggression toward the DPRK, I wanted to kind of place the DPRK in this world situation. So right now, and this is, I don't think is unique in the history of, let's say, the American empire, imperialism in general, but at this moment, you have a situation where the division that the U.S. is stoking on the Korean Peninsula between the North and the South, between DPRK and the so-called ROK, that is being ramped up in different forms all across the world. The two biggest examples of this right now that more people are talking about, most people aren't talking about the DPRK and the possibility of the U.S. reigniting a war that, remember everyone, this is still happening. This is a war that does not have a peace treaty. There was just a cessation of hostilities. But fewer people are talking about that than they are talking about, let's say, Russia and Ukraine, for example, which is a huge example of how the United States and how NATO is trying to divide and conquer. It's trying to divide Ukraine from Russia. It's trying to literally divide a big piece of Russia, or of Ukraine from Russia, and stoking war there. And then you also have China now, where you have all these think tanks talking about preparing for the next war. They're talking about Taiwan, and they're trying to literally separate a territory of China from Taiwan. Could you place what's happening to the DPRK in this global context? Because what often makes me so angry is how the DPRK is placed in this kind of exceptional realm, that it doesn't have this role. And so I want to talk both about, maybe if you could, the relationship that the DPRK has to this global situation that people are facing, that nations are facing with imperialism. And then we can talk more about the positive role. But let's talk about how you think the DPRK relates to the overall world situation at this moment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So yeah, like with the ramping of aggression, and that's just, due to the changing of geopolitical conditions, right? We're starting to see a shift towards multipolarity, right? We're seeing, NATO expansionism, as you mentioned, in Eastern Europe, and sort of like this cracking of U.S. hegemony, right? And so the DPRK is basically responding to these changing conditions. So, this rising multipolarity can be seen, from major economic deals, right? They're happening outside the US dollar. The US dollar hegemony was at one point strong, right? But now we're kind of seeing a shift away from that. Um, China is now purchasing Russian oil through rubles and yuan, right? For example, more and more trade is happening outside the US dollar. So that means that there's a greater opportunity, right, to exist in an economic system that is not controlled by the US or that is not burdened by US sanctions. Um, Speaking more towards the DPRK, right? The DPRK or North Korea is probably one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. And so, of course, an economic system that is unburdened by US sanctions could be a great opportunity for North Korea. Or, excuse me, economic system of trade that is unburdened by US sanctions could be a great opportunity for North Korea. And we're also seeing, a stronger, strong alliance between China, Russia, and the DPRK, right? The United States has been pursuing war against these three countries because they do not simply bow down to U.S. will or U.S. pressure. And so there's a natural alliance to be had among those who, share a common enemy.
Yeah. Yeah. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that. Let's maybe start with China, because
Mhm.
this is something the Western media, they love to play up China as almost the mediator. You see it with Russia and Ukraine. You see the Western corporate media say China is not doing enough to stop Russia. Aren't you guys best friends? Why don't you stop Russia doing what it's doing in Ukraine? And the same kind of goes for the DPRK, right? There's a lot of framing of China as this mediator, that China that this relationship is not strong, that this relationship is kind of tepid, that there's a lot of wherever there's disagreements, there's a lot of wherever there's agreements, there's a lot of disagreements. Could you talk about the DPRK China relationship? They share a border, they share a rich history. I don't know if you could you could you talk about that, because I find it to be fascinating the way that
Mhm.
this relationship is kind of buried under just all of the all of the debris from the West's propaganda apparatus.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I can definitely try to kind of lay out the China and DPRK relationship. It's a long one, so I can at least touch on a couple of points. So yeah, so historically, after the liberation of Korea, right after Japanese colonialism, China and the DPRK kind of share that commonality history that they were both colonized by Japan um, up until 1945. When Japan surrendered in World War II, right? And then we see kind of the emergence of China winning its revolution in 1949, and then we see the creation or the inception of the DPRK as we know of it now in 1948. So within 1 year or so, you have the inception of China, and you also have the inception of the DPRK, right? Um, and so, when the Korean War broke out in 1950, you know, uh, you had a lot of volunteers from the People's Liberation Army, right? Chinese PLA volunteer soldiers that were fighting with the DPRK to try to drive out the United States and what the quote unquote United Nation forces, which is just really the United States and other um, other Western countries. Yeah, and so we see this kind of strong relationship over the years, and so now because the DPRK is so sanctioned by the United States, right, and other Western countries, so much so that you can't even import sand, right, sand or graphite, like these are very, very heavy sanctions. And so they must do a lot of trade with China. And so there's like a very strong trade agreement and then also a very strong diplomatic relationship. Um, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, not many people know. I mean, first off, the Korean War was not that long ago. I think it's what the 73rd anniversary of its launches. It's basically where we're at, and it's only been 70 years since the cessation of hostilities. Not that long ago,
Right.
but the not many people understand that China sacrificed 200,000 people, sent a couple of million people to fight alongside, and most of it was Northern Korea, was the Liberation Army in Northern Korea that would eventually become the DPRK. That's where they were fighting. There's a great movie about this too, the Battle of Changjin, that everyone should watch. You should definitely find that movie and watch it. It's great, although it's less on the Korea side. But I do, I do want to continue on this thread though between the DPRK and the world, because you said it. The DPRK is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, and could you talk about the impact of these sanctions? Because I asked about what is the DPRK's role and its relationship with the world. But you just said it's the DPRK cannot even import certain commodities. And
Right.
much of the world economic system is still dollar dominated. I think 80% of all foreign currency reserves are still the US dollar. And that means, as we're seeing with the Russia Ukraine situation, that a lot, right, they're trying to, the sanctions have backfired there, but the EU and the US have tried to use that advantage to squeeze Russia, not just through direct sanctions on its economy, but trying to get certain corporations to not allow their let's say their shipping in facilities, that sort of thing, to basically bar Russia from being able to even use huge parts of the supply chain itself in order to get certain commodities. But the DPRK has been facing this for a very, very long time. Could you talk about the impact of the sanctions and how you feel like they affect the DPRK's ability to really join or be a very proactive member of this multipolar world that's emerging?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, I can say that, yeah, like I said before, like you can't even import sand or graphite without, facing the wrath of the United States, right? The impact of sanctions, certain things cannot be imported. They have to basically try to either try to get things sent in, or they try to produce stuff. um, yeah, and so these sanctions are very, very heavy, and so even trying to get through, like, even humanitarian aid, right, is it can be kind of difficult, right? And so there's a campaign going on right now to try to um, you know get humanitarian aid into the DPRK, right? Um, yeah, and so we're like medical things. They try to get by with a lot of medical stuff that is desperately needed. And there's just these sanctions are um, very crushing, and they need to be lifted post haste. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's talk about the role of reunification here then, because I think a big part of what the United States is doing worldwide, right?
Mhm.
It's kind of like this balkanization versus sovereignty struggle versus self-determination struggle happening worldwide, where you have the United States trying to use every weapon in its arsenal to splinter countries. And when I'm saying countries, I mean countries like the DPRK, like
Mhm.
China, that represent a direct threat to what it sees as its continued hegemony. So you see that with Korea, you see that with China, you see that with Russia, you see that in so many other instances as well, all over Latin America. So
Mhm.
I wanted to ask about reunification because, unlike reunification between Taiwan and China, where right now it's internationally recognized that
Mhm.
Taiwan and China are one China, and even the United States has multiple agreements. Right now, you have a situation where you have the DPRK seen as a pariah state worldwide, and often
Mhm.
kept out of any kind of economic and political participation in world affairs,
Mhm.
and the so-called Republic of Korea, which is basically a law. At least its government acts as a real kind of launching pad for U.S. militarism. So where are we in the reunification process? Because it seems like things are escalating. It seems like Biden is in some ways worse than the Donald Trump administration, in that I feel like I've seen little movement in the diplomatic process. And then of course you've had political changes in South Korea. So could you talk about reunification? Maybe you could go over some of that history and then where we are now with it.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess I can touch on a couple things. Just for background. So as towards the end of the 19th century, we saw like a changing of geopolitical landscape, right? European powers were carving out um, large sections of the world, in Asia, Africa, and then in South America. United States, even before 1945, was, they were already interested in, interest in Korea, right? Um, you know, and then we see, this the stretching of colonial influence from the U.S., right? The Spanish American War, the colonization of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Philippines, Guam, etc., etc. Um, and then we see the sort of agreement between the United States and Japan, basically green lighting um, the colonization of Korea by Japan, in conjunction with the colonization of the Philippines by the United States. So that is the Taft-Katsura agreement. Um, and so after 45, right, we see the provisions made for a people's government um, under a united Korea. The United States caught wind of that, basically overthrew that military government and installed a military, or I'm sorry, overthrew the people, the provisional government, and then installed a military government. That was in 46, 47. Basically drew all of the members underground from that provisional government. And then 1948, we see the election of Sigmunri, right? Under a quote unquote UN, right, election, which is basically a US election. And so we, under that sort of under the regime, right? He basically was starting a campaign to snuff out any communists, any sort of people that were against the U.S. occupation, or those he considered to be quote unquote political dissidents. Kind of like a Red Scare, like what would be similar to a Red Scare here in the United States, right, during the 1950s. And so there was a large resistance to the U.S. occupation and also the regime happening on Jeju. And so there was a very large resistance on Jeju against the U.S. military occupation. With full support of the U.S. military, the South Korean government basically went in and basically burned everything, killed a bunch of people on the island, right, and then arrested thousands of others, so that the Jeju uprising, right, that happened in 1948, and then so we see in the decades after, right, the positioning of Park Chan-hee, of Chun Do-han, right, these military dictators who were in full support of the Carter administration, the Reagan administration, right, and then in 1987 there was a large there was a very large movement, the democratization movement, to oust the military government, right, that brought thousands into the streets, right. And so these what these movements show is that the interests of the South Korean government, or the national bourgeoisie, right, and the U.S. military do not represent the legitimate will of the Korean people. So I want to touch a little bit on reunification, right? In 2018, the Panmunjom Declaration was when leaders of both North and South Korea met to talk about working towards reunification, but it came to a stall. It required participation of the United States in these efforts. So we saw with the Hanoi talks, right, and the talks after with Donald Trump. So talking about sanctions, the U.S. uses sanctions to impede any sort of reunification efforts, right? Yeah, vocally or on paper, they will say, that they will support both Korea efforts. In reality, they encourage these attacks through military exercises. The U.S. and the UN command controls the DMZ, right? The very long demilitarization border. Through things like this, they are impeding economic cooperation through projects such as the Inter-Korean Railway. So there was a railway that was propositioned to be built, but the U.S. basically said no. Yeah, they impede any sort of economic cooperation. So like I said before, the U.S. and also the South Korean governments intentionally block reunification efforts. For example, this kind of ties into Sigmunri's, Red Scare tactics. So he, in 1948, he established the National Security Law. So, South Korea uses the national security law to crack down on anything that is related to North Korea, reunification, or socialism or communism, right? Yes, like I said, it was enacted in 1948 and then used to suppress the 1948 Jeju uprising. Yeah, on top of that, they used the NSL to suppress knowledge of massacres, labeling them as, pro-North speech. And just 2 days ago, actually, more recently, 2 days ago, the Jeju office, the June 15th committee, was raided by the National Intelligence Service, the NIS, or formerly known as the KCIA, for screening The Story of Our Home, basically a film, a very heartwarming film, about a family in North Korea. And then there was also arrests of a very minor party, the Progressive Party. A senior official was arrested, and then arrested, and then the Secretary General of the Korean Peasants League was home was raided by the NIS more recently. So basically, the U.S. and the South Korean governments have basically tried to stall any sort of reunification efforts.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe end on the where you see things going with this ongoing escalation of the United States toward the DPRK. It seems like under the Trump administration, there was a framework. I remember, right, the Singapore summit, there was documents that came out, and it's pretty clear that uh, in the documents that came out of that denuclearization wasn't even the top priority. In it was, creating an environment for peaceful cooperation and creating some kind of diplomatic path to normalization. But all of that seems so far away now. And immediately as that was happening, you had the Democratic Party, certain elements of the Republican Party, and of course the Trump administration itself, when it finally did sit down, said it basically completely rejected the very framework from which the talks were established. And now we are where we are, where it seems like the military aspect of this is kind of the only part of the relationship. So where do you see things going? Do you see this changing for the better or for worse? Or what's your sense of where you think things are going to go, and maybe where you hope things will go, and what will be needed to get that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just for clarification, you mean in terms of denuclearization, or do you mean in terms of reunification?
Oh, well, I mean, in terms of just overall the situation between the US and the DPRK, the situation on the Korean Peninsula. It could include denuclearization, or it could be other aspects of this relationship. But yeah, I mean, where do you see things going there? And also for the DPRK, I mean, this is a very dire situation. It's very difficult and challenging. Yet the DPRK remains a very resilient country. Maybe you could also talk about where you think things are going to go for the DPRK as well.
Yeah. I guess I'll start with basically what's been happening right now in South Korea. So, in terms of like the Yoon government and what's been going on in terms of that, so as I mentioned before, the Yoon government has been taking more of a war hawkish stance towards inter-Korean relations with DPRK and pro-US and pro-Japan stance. His domestic policies are a little bit more entrenched with neoliberalism. So if people don't know what neoliberalism is, it's a form of free market capitalism defined by trade liberalization, globalization, widening of private sector, slashing of public and social services, etc., etc. with his promises of cutting the minimum wage, the abolishment of the Ministry of Family and Gender Equality. So recently, the government threatens. The government had threatened striking truck workers, right, with fines and jail time if they had not gone back to work, right. Truck workers were striking in response to rising fuel costs, low wages for long hours, and then dangerous driving conditions. This comes in conjunction with the massive general strike that happened last year, right? The recent war exercises and RIMPAC activity have prompted demonstrations from the South Korean public, right? With some groups calling towards an end of U.S. occupation, an end to the Yoon government, and also the removal of all U.S. military activity on the peninsula. This could lead to a second candlelight revolution, like in 2016 and 17. So, for those who don't know the Candlelight Revolution was a massive movement to oust then South Korean President Park Geun-hye in her response of a couple things. One was the Sewol disaster in 2014, and then also the scandal that happened where her administration was basically taking money from chaebols. It was like an embezzlement scandal. So that led to a very long, big movement to oust that government. So we could see something like that. In terms of denuclearization and reunification, the U.S. has expanded its antagonisms towards North Korea since Biden and Yoon took office. This will likely continue, and if it does, we are headed towards war in the entirety of the Asia Pacific. North Korea has no plans to denuclearize. They have denuclearization on the table for negotiations for a long time. But the U.S. has been ramping up aggressions and escalations, so they kind of take it off the table now. However, Koreans will continue organizing towards reunification, and the DPRK will continue to try to defend itself against imperialist aggression. Koreans in the South have been protesting, widespread protests against Yoon and against Yoon's war hawkish stance, against his corruption, etc., etc. And going back to the point on the negotiations for denuclearization, the U.S. has refused to give up sanctions, has refused to stop escalating, right? I think the most important point to end off on this one is that we here in the United States also need to organize for the U.S. to out of Korea. We need to organize against U.S. imperialist wars abroad everywhere, whether that be in Korea or in Ukraine, right? So, the time is now to really get organized, to really get the ball rolling, so to speak, on these on organizing and really getting into producing or organizing a really broad anti-war movement. It's also anti-imperialist as well. So yes. So to reiterate, Koreans will continue to organize towards reunification, and the DPRK will continue to try to defend itself against imperial aggression. Right. This is in response to imperialist aggression. This doesn't come out of nowhere. Right. So thank you.
Yeah. No problem. I mean, that's completely correct. And while the DPRK may not be negotiating around its nuclear arsenal, and how can you blame the DPRK there at this point in history? The DPRK had been open to that, right? I mean, imagine in 1964, I believe China built its first nuclear weapon. Imagine if China negotiated away its nuclear weapons. I don't know if we would be talking about China in the way that we are now. I mean, there really is a huge deterrent effect here. And when all other methods and mechanisms for building an environment for peace are exhausted, what else does the DPRK have but the strongest weapon for self-defense? A lot of people don't like to hear that, but that is the environment that the DPRK has not created. That's the environment that the United States has created. And I think oftentimes when it comes to the DPRK, there's so much of this. To me, it's even almost more egregious than what it's done to China. There's almost like, well, yeah, the United States is bad, but look at the DPRK. Look at how strange it is. Look at how repressive it is. It's a communist country. Look at it. They don't allow anyone to have a haircut that's different from Kim Jong Un, right? So, I know I said maybe we can close on that past point, but I don't know if you want to make any comments about the DPRK in particular and
Mhm.
how you see its right to self-defense being exerted here, and how you see, um, you know, the role of this propaganda war against the DPRK playing out in the larger situation that it faces.
Yeah. I think I'm I just tell it like it is. You know what I mean? I'm honest about it. I'm just like, this is a country that has been sanctioned to the sanctioned to no end, right? Has been consistently, separated from the rest of the peninsula, right? The war still goes on. The U.S. the one of the largest U.S. The largest militaries in the world is standing, right across from the DMZ. Right? There's no, you know, I just tell it like it is, and so, I what I tell people about when these sorts of stories come up, right? About um, these propaganda stories, right? I remember I saw there was an article by Radio Free Asia, yeah, talking
A
about
favorite.
yeah, talking about how North Korea executed three teenagers for I think it was watching K dramas or K-pop or something like that, and it's I'm just like, what, how, first and foremost, that's just Radio Free Asia, that's supported by U.S. corporate media, right? And then I say well, I think of what goes on here in the United States, right? What goes on here in the United States? You have police violence. You have you know people being killed by police. Here in the United States, Black people being killed by police in the United States. You have widespread, you have people going hungry, or having to choose between paying their light bill or buying groceries and stuff like. Um, yeah, I'm just but no one you don't see the UN, right, calling for sanctions against the United States, right? That's only because the United States is control, has the majority of the United Nations is made up of the United States and other Western nations. So yeah, I just tell it like it is. I'm just honest. Look what we see here in the United States. This is literally like a projection, right, of what goes on here in the United States. And then I,
Yeah.
connect it to the propaganda machine, or all these different avenues of the where the United States is trying to ramp up aggression, ramp up the um, this sort of tension. Mhm.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Well, Riley, it was really good to have you on the program this evening. I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of plug where people can find you, or where anything else that you'd like people to go to find your work. Also, if you could tell people where to find the socialist education in Korea. I couldn't find the link for some reason. It's Iskra Books, I believe, correct? But could you also maybe do that as well in there?
Yeah, yeah. So you can, well, first you can follow Nodutdol on social media. You can follow Nodutdol on Instagram and on Twitter, and those sorts of things. Yeah, you can find socialist education in Korea through Ishka Books. If you go, and that's supported through the Peace, Land, and Bread collective. If you go to Peace, Land, and Bread's Instagram or social media, you will be able to find a link towards their books. You can also follow me on Twitter. Blank Taicho, BLANKTYCHO.
All right. All right, Riley. Thanks so much. Stick around, everyone. I'm going to cover a few stories. But good night, Riley. And yeah, we'll have to connect here with Nodutdol at some point in the near future as things develop. Take care.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye bye. All right, everyone. We got a few stories to cover. All right. I'm going to do that. Well, yeah, a few stories. I want to try to get through both. And I'll see actually where we're at after the first. But I want to definitely cover at least one of them. And of course, do shout outs. Make sure I answer the super chats. That was a really good conversation. I mean, the DPRK, Korea, there's so much to talk about, and we could have probably stream after stream after stream. But I definitely wanted to give the DPRK, the Korea situation, its proper due, especially given how geopolitics has been mainly Russia and China centered, and for very good reason. But we cannot forget about the DPRK as well. We can't forget about that war, which is ongoing, the Korean War, which is ongoing, and it's led by the United States. But with that said, everyone, it's a bit of a quieter night this evening. I don't know what's going on with YouTube. There's been a lot of strange things happening. I think all creators had a really strange development where views were literally being taken from our videos. It was very strange. We were having our views decrease in real time. They supposedly fixed that issue, but I've noticed since the new year that the streaming has been a lot more. I don't know if it's notifications. I don't know if it's just a matter of the algorithm changing, but I have noticed that things have gotten a little quieter on this channel. But nonetheless, we will keep pushing forward and doing the consistent work here to ensure that the broadest possible scope of geopolitics is covered, and that the consistency is there. So, anyway, I wanted to talk about a few stories. I hope to get a guest on about Soledar, but I do want to talk about it to a degree. I'm going to play a little bit of a Duran video because Alex and Alexander over at the Duran, I thought, had a really good analysis of the narrative that I think is really important after Soledar. So, yesterday it was reported that essentially Russia had taken the city of Soledar in the Donbass, that it had defeated Ukraine's forces. This was the Wagner Group, which is a private military contractor. It had defeated Ukraine's forces handedly, right? A real major defeat. It puts a real dent, I mean, a major dent in Ukraine's Donbass line of defense. And it could be a major turning point in this conflict. And of course, there's been a particular narrative about it. But first, let's get to the conflict. Let's get to the information that we need to know about what happened. And so here, RT reports that the Wagner Group claimed full control of Soledar. This was yesterday on, a couple of days ago, but late on the 10th. Wagner Group claims full control of Soledar. Ukrainian troops are reportedly trapped in the Donbass town. So the Wagner Group units have taken control of the entire territory of Soledar. The head of the private military company, Yevgeny Prigozhin, claimed on Tuesday evening. Fighting is continuing in the center of the town, where an unknown number of Ukrainian soldiers have been encircled. So essentially, they were either killed or taken as prisoners. So this is a little bit outdated, but nonetheless, the point is that there's a cauldron in the center of town where urban fighting is taking place, and will announce the number of prisoners tomorrow. A video showing two Wagner Group fighters standing outside the town administration building was released on social media earlier that day. Such recordings, usually accompanied with geospatial coordinates, have commonly been used during the conflict to announce territorial control. Named after its salt lines, Soledar had around 10,000 residents before the conflict, and the Ukrainian army had turned into a strong point after being pushed out of Popasnaya in mid-2022. Russian control over the town creates problems for Kiev's forces in the embattled bastion of Artemovsk, which Ukraine has renamed Bakhmut. Prigozhin said last week that his objective was not necessarily to take the towns, but the destruction of the Ukrainian army and the reduction of its combat potential. So on Sunday, President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine acknowledged that the situation in Soledar was very difficult, called it one of the bloodiest spots along the front lines, but vowed that Ukrainian troops would hold it no matter what. So that didn't happen. This town has been taken. It's a major defeat for Ukraine. And now what we've seen is a really deep narrative war, a propaganda war, to tell us that Ukraine is actually not only going to be fine, but that Ukraine is winning the war, that Ukraine is somehow going to defeat Russia and it's going to keep going. And you have Zelensky, even though he acknowledged it's very difficult in Soledar and that the situation was difficult, he has not acknowledged the defeat. And this is despite the fact that a lot of Ukraine's top, defense minister, etc., were warning about this. We're talking about how many troops, how many soldiers were being killed, and that the situation was very dire. But nonetheless, we've had a big narrative war around Soledar. And so I want to play what the Duran had to say about the narrative, because I think it's very important. I think this is what's most important to me, because I think, when it comes to military expertise, that's not what I have. It's obviously a major loss for Ukraine. Anytime that Russia can make advances when its strategy right now is just the meat grinder, it's just a war of attrition, it's just a matter of slowly grinding down Ukraine's military. A major victory within that context means that things aren't going so well for Ukraine, and it's likely a sign of things to come. It's not to say that we're not going to see any any more offenses from Ukraine, or that Ukraine isn't going to try to throw more people at the front lines to try to wage an offensive at some point during this conflict. But what it means is that, well, the line has been holding pretty steady. The line that has been drawn, the line of conflict that's been drawn, has been holding pretty steady. There's really been no gains anywhere other than Russia making pretty big gains in grinding down Ukraine's military and its infrastructure. That's what's been happening. And now Soledar has fallen to Russia, and it has caused a bit of a panic, and it's created what is a narrative, the need for narrative management. So let me play for you what the Duran had to say about that, about how they're going to spin the situation, because I think it's very interesting, and I happen to agree very much so with what they're saying. So let's play it.
Well, the entire narrative of the collective West, whether it's been NATO officials, the Biden White House, the EU officials, the media, Zelensky, the entire narrative is built on the premise that NATO and Ukraine are going to push Russia out of Ukrainian lands, including Crimea. mean, that's been the entire framing of this of how the collective West and Ukraine are going to take on Russia. That is the goal. The goal is Russia pre-1991, Ukraine pre-1991 borders.
Yeah.
And they go on about that, and they've gone on
Yes.
about that,
Yes.
article after article, speech after speech, statement after statement. So when you see the territory in reverse being taken by the Russians, and you couple that with horrendous, terrible, catastrophic loss in personnel and equipment, then people are going to start to say, wait a minute, we've been told one thing and we're seeing everything, all the metrics moving in a completely opposite direction. And then you can also make the economic argument as well. Russia's
Yes.
economy is going to be in tatters. They see everything moving in a different direction than what they've been led to believe. And that's a problem. While Russia, they have said, Surovikin has specifically said, my goal as commander at this point is to grind down the Ukraine military. I mean, he said that. So it's going to be slow. It's going to be a war of attrition. But my goal is to grind down the Ukraine military, demilitarization. Yes, there's territory involved. Yes, Russia has incorporated 4 new regions, but it's always been about fighting the Ukraine military beyond and above anything else. And when Russia needs to retreat from territory in order to preserve personnel and equipment, they do that without any hesitation. And they take the media hits.
So what Alex is really describing there is the fantasy that's been created by Ukraine, that's been created by the Western corporate media, that's been created by the collective West, the United States in the lead, about Ukraine, that Ukraine is doing incredibly on the battlefield, that Russia's doing so poorly both on the battlefield, its economy is in tatters. You've had this mythical narrative being so powerful in terms of its reach and its scope that this battle, this loss of Soledar that Ukraine just experienced is really kind of this wake-up call that won't really be heeded, and you already see it not be heeded, of course, by the Western political establishment, because that would go against its interests. But it'll be very interesting to see how this affects overall public opinion, because not only is this happening, this loss of Soledar, but it spells kind of the future of where this conflict is going. But let's continue, because Alexander, I think, makes really good points about how this will all be spun.
That is exactly right. I mean, the Russians have a much simpler task explaining what's going on to their public and in their media, because, well, I mean, they've been fairly consistent in what they've been saying for many months now. Not always, but for very, very months now. Whereas the West has been consistently promoting this story about Ukraine resisting, Ukraine winning, Ukraine recovering all its lost lands, that sort of thing. I will say that every so often, you do see some people in the West come forward and say that the objective is to push Russia back to the 24th February lines, which of course would mean Crimea is still under Russian control, and it would still mean the Donbass regions, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as they were constituted before the start of the most recent fighting, being pushed back to that point. I don't think that, though, is anywhere close to being the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative is very much the one you said. Well, they are going to get into this trap, but it's a trap of their own making. And I don't know how they get out of it. I mean, I suspect the way they get out of it is one you've touched on in the past, which is that they relegate the story. They start moving on to some other story, Taiwan, maybe, Iran, something else. But they don't talk as much about Ukraine, and
Well, what's really interesting about that point is that you've had a flurry of stories. You've had the Financial Times interview the top U.S. General James Balmier in Japan, saying that the U.S. is laying the groundwork, setting the theater, he says, which is military speak, for a war with China over Taiwan through its overall militarization of the Asia Pacific. You also have the Center for Strategic in International Studies, this U.S. State Department funded think tank. This think tank is also funded by major military contractors, major allied governments, including the so-called government of Taiwan. This think tank also came out with a war simulation over Taiwan. So you've already had, and this is all just in the last week, so you've already had a major shift in the attention, right? It's not just Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. The United States' corporate media, the Western corporate media, loves to talk about Ukraine when they can frame it as things are going well. But now this is a moment where you cannot spin it. You cannot say, oh, well, Ukraine actually won in Soledar. No. And you can't say, well, things are going to be good from here on out after Soledar, because it actually is a pretty big deal. And because Bakhmut is also likely going to go the same way at some point. We can't predict when, but at some point, it'll probably go the same direction with a Russian victory. So the writing's on the wall, and I think that's exactly right, that there has already been a lot of suppression, a lot of just redirecting people's eyes to the next war.
Try to sort of play down the significance of what's happening in Ukraine. That's one possibility. The other possibility, which we can never discount, is that they double and triple down. So they've sent Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. They've sent Marder infantry fighting vehicles. They've sent Paladin self-propelled guns. This is the latest weapons delivery. They've sent Patriots. Now they're going to send Aster air defense missiles. Not going to make any significant difference. There are not that many of them. Then don't provide much of a new capability. They're going to send heavy battle tanks, Leopard 2s, Challenger 2s from Britain, perhaps Leclercs from France, perhaps even Abrams that they're from the US, that they're ruling that out from the moment. And of course, ultimately, always the danger that they might try and persuade some of the East European states of NATO, like Poland, to become directly involved in the fighting. And of course, Poland is now talking about setting up a new division on the eastern borders, equipped exclusively with Western equipment, Abrams tanks, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and perhaps, just possibly, that's earmarked for some kind of intervention in Ukraine. So I think it's going to be one or the other, it seems to me. They're either going to try to forget the whole story, pretend this all didn't happen, or, relegate it to a sort of minor affair, or in the alternative, they double, triple down in exactly the way I've just said, and which we've discussed on previous programs. But it's going to be one or the other. I mean, they can't, accept that this has been a straightforward defeat, because far too many political reputations now hang on this, and far more journalistic reputations hang on this as well, by the way.
So, that's all I'll play from the clip, but I do want to, I think it's the second point is interesting as well, because that's just how the pattern of this conflict has gone anyway. So it would be kind of remiss to think, oh yeah, well, the United States and the collective West, they're going to take this defeat and say, we'll do the rational thing, which is figure out how to develop an off-ramp. Absolutely not. The United States, NATO, they're going to try to figure out another way to get what they want, another way to prolong this. And that will be through weapons, of course. But, there's a big problem with that. We've talked about it here. NATO weapons stockpiles are depleted. Production, transferring of these weapons is not going to be easy. It's going to take time. And that's why the U.S. is going to have to rely on NATO allies like Poland to do some of this dirty work, with the weapons that it provided Poland over the course of the years when it was militarizing and doing military exercises and preparing the way for this kind of thing. That's what NATO encirclement has always been about. So, I think that's exactly right. That it's going to be more weapons and it's going to be more propaganda, and there's propaganda by omission as well. And so those are two of the big ways. I don't think it's one or the other, though. I think that both can be done, because I think that when you lay the groundwork of getting people's eyes away from the reality of the situation, like they're doing in Soledar, then you can start building up the conditions for prolonging the war, because you will have people, not so much the general public in the West, those forces who might be sparked into wanting more, wanting peace, wanting an end to this thing. I mean, people are already pretty sick of this, but to keep people from going the next step in that process, divert their attention to the next thing, right? Divert their attention to Taiwan. I'm writing an article on Foreign Policy Magazine, had this massive article on these 12 areas to prepare for the next war. That's how they framed it. And the next war, of course, is with China over Taiwan. But they try to dance around it, but it's very direct. And you have people like David Petraeus, war criminal, someone who literally presided over, when he was the top commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan and occupied Afghanistan, presided over the missile strikes and drone strikes of weddings, public events, civilian areas. War criminal David Petraeus is part of this. You have all of these major think tanks like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Alliance of Democracies, the International Institute for Strategic Studies. All of these are basically institutions that are aligned or completely wholly owned subsidiaries of the military-industrial complex. And so, you have these forces, and also two former NATO secretary generals, one being under Obama, one being under Trump, but both of them being kind of Obama attached, aligned forces, all of them arguing what's needed is more weapons, more sanctions, more advanced production lines, the ability to make weapons faster, scrap the old Cold War production system, make sure that you're fighting the propaganda war and that you're controlling what people think and what people know about war, because big bad China, big bad Russia are trying to divert your eyes in a manner to make them think that the U.S. and the collective West are the problem. Cyber technology, all these areas, all with one purpose: to tell you should go. You should be okay with the future war over Taiwan with China. And so they're already looking at this, because I think they know that the writing is on the wall, that Ukraine is not going so well right now. Soledar is just one instance. But what's so interesting about how the development of this conflict has transpired and what's happened is that even now, where you have Bakhmut probably going to fall to Russia, now you had Soledar, a victory for Russia in Soledar, and you've also had just a stagnant conflict situation for a while that's only been really characterized by Russia making pretty hard offensive strikes on Ukraine's military infrastructure and its overall infrastructure, weakening its capacity to fight this war at all, grinding down Ukraine's military. You still have the Western corporate media saying, we won, we're winning, look how weak Russia is. And that was the case in this article as well. So Alex and Alexander are right. There are these very few options for the US and NATO to take to spin what's going on in this conflict, to spin the actual reality on the ground, which is that Ukraine really doesn't stand a chance. It never did. Ukraine never stood a chance here. How could it? Ukraine was always a very poor country since its inception. Ukraine went through a massive coup. Ukraine didn't stand a chance in this moment to defeat Russia. But that never really was the point, right? The point has always been encircle Russia with NATO, use Ukraine as the primary proxy to weaken Russia, and hope that the overall strength of each part of this proxy war, the sanctions, the military conflict, the propaganda war, all of it would lead to Russia's downfall. But that hasn't happened. And Soledar has them just going kind of mad, right? They're losing, they're declining in terms of their logic, their rationality, their stability. They're really having a tough time with this, and as they should. Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot because I think it points the way to what is going to happen now globally in 2023. We're going to see, I think, the United States, like the honeymoon, in my opinion, is over. The Biden administration didn't even try. There are times when presidential administrations try to establish some kind of mechanism for normalization. And all we got was a little bit of forward movement with Venezuela because the United States is desperate for that energy and that oil. But really not much because sanctions on Venezuela still continue, even if they aren't as strong. But we didn't get any progress with the DPRK, as we showed earlier on the program. We haven't gotten any with Russia. Things have only gotten worse. With China, things haven't really gotten better. No matter how many breaths are taken, deep breaths are taken, where things kind of pause a bit, you still see massive escalations there. Not least the last week of just utter chatter, this loud cacophony for preparations with war with China. You see these massive escalations with China happening under Biden to a degree where we could very well say we've only seen a buildup from the Trump administration. We haven't seen any rollback of anything in that regard. Iran, what have we seen with Iran? We've just seen the disintegration of the JPCOA agreement. It hasn't come back. Biden promised it would come back. It hasn't come back. Sanctions on Iran are still going strong. And of course, the United States' presence in the Middle East after that botched withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 has also been the same. It's been a pariah. It's been all about occupation. And now it's all about trying to divide that region from China and from Russia, trying to strong arm Saudi Arabia. Things haven't gotten better, right? Things haven't gotten better in that area as well. So the United States at this point under Biden has not even had any sort of attempt, right? As we enter the latter half of its first term of its administration, who knows if there will be a second term, but we haven't seen any kind of attempt to build a legacy. Even Obama, during the pivot to Asia, during the encirclement campaign against Russia, in the first term, tried to play diplomacy with both countries. Of course, that all went absolutely down down the trash chute when the United States facilitated the coup in Ukraine in 2014, and of course, really ramped up the encirclement campaign with China, and of course, the information war as well. But even Obama during the early period was trying to play diplomacy. It was in this area with certain aspects. And then, of course, you had the JPCOA, which was kind of Obama's so-called baby. I wouldn't say that Obama should be credited for that because there were a lot of huge flaws and things that were not in Iran's interests. And it was very heavily weighted toward the U.S. and the Western powers. But at the same time, Obama could claim that. Biden is, to me, an even worse kind of Obama, because while Obama had more fertile ground to be a more effective evil, the United States was in a much better position economically, politically. Well, I shouldn't say economically because it was coming off the heels of the 2007-2008 crisis, but it's still, even after that crisis, was a bigger economy. And then it also still had a lot more weight internationally because China and Russia, think about this, guys. China and Russia were weaker, so much weaker, just 12 years ago, 13 years ago, right? So things have changed so rapidly. In the Biden administration, all it can do is escalate, escalate, escalate. And that's what's going to happen after Soledar, because they're desperate to keep things the way they are, to keep this permanency of war in Ukraine, because it is a boon for profits for the stocks of these major military contractors, these big monopolies that have monopolized the weapons industry. It's a boon for Wall Street. And of course, it's a boon for the US's political legitimacy and its ability to corner Europe and to continue its pursuit of fully privatizing and ultimately making Europe politically subservient as well. So privatizing its economy and making it politically subservient to the United States in just in totality without any interruption. And that's why we see the Biden administration continue to pursue what it's doing in Ukraine. And Soledar is not going to be any kind of lesson for the United States. What it's going to be is another reason why the United States has to give more, has to support more. But there are limits to all of this. And at this point, unlike under Obama, there are far more limits to what the United States' empire, what its military apparatus, what its entire system can do in this situation when faced against a country like Russia, which, you know, has the capacity to both defend itself and wage offensive operations. We're talking about Russia, which still has 100,000 plus troops ready to go to continue the meat grinder and also possibly score more victories like this and create even more fertile terrain for the United States to feel the pressure, for NATO to feel the pressure of a changing course in this conflict. I don't think it will, but at some point, things are going to have to shift in some manner, whether it's the United States and NATO doing the unthinkable, escalating to the point where there is a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, more direct than now. Russia saying it's fighting NATO, but this could turn hot, or whether it's forced to come to some kind of ceasefire agreement, which we know it wouldn't follow anyway. So that's the first story I wanted to cover tonight, guys. Now I want to talk about what happened with Brazil quickly with all of you, because Pepe Escobar, friend of the show, wrote, I think, a really great article on this situation. And so, you know, you all saw what happened, right? January 8th, there was a riot in Brasilia, in the capital, where the Brazilian government resides, its government buildings, its Congress, etc. You probably saw what happened. It was a wild scene. You had QAnon kind of folks, right? You had like a Brazil QAnon shaman. It was very, very awkward. You had these Bolsonaristas, right? These Bolsonaro supporters coming together in mass to basically vandalize the building and really stage a coup. They didn't succeed. Similar to January 6th, where there was all this talk about a potential coup. Unclear whether that was ever the case with January 6th, but there's all these comparisons being made. But for this situation, it's important, I think, to even be more serious because of the situation in Latin America and how the United States has ultimately wielded its influence to facilitate coups in that region decade after decade after decade. Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, Salvador Allende in Chile. We can go on and on and on. The United States has been a force for destabilization in Latin America, supported the dictatorship from 64 to 85, right? The fascist military dictatorship in Brazil, and was a big part of the judicial coup that ousted Dilma Rousseff, and of course, all of the really shady goings on with Lula da Silva in 2018 when he was imprisoned. Now, Lula is president, and while there's been a lot of, I think, misinformation, or I should say just distortions of Lula da Silva, I think one thing that's quite clear is that the United States is not a fan of Lula, whether they'll say it or not right now. They're not a fan of Lula's foreign policy, especially. And let's be clear. While the United States hasn't taken an outright hostile position to Lula, some people are even saying, oh, the Biden administration is defending Lula da Silva. Let's be really clear here. The United States has allowed Jair Bolsonaro to remain. Not only has he conducted what could be considered a January 6th style coup, but also he's in the United States right now, just walking around, and part of that was because he was still had that presidential, he was still considered the president when he came, and Lula hadn't been inaugurated yet, and so he traveled early, very suspicious, given the state of the Florida elite, or the oligarchs that leave countries like Brazil, they leave countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and sometimes these forces end up conducting operations that end up happening abroad. We saw that throughout the 80s in Cuba. Of course, the Bay of Pigs is the most celebrated example of what kind of terrorism the United States can generate from Florida. So I want to talk about what a theory, but I think he backs it up with a lot of facts. Pepe Escobar had to say about what's going on in Brazil, because he likens it to a Maidan uprising. And why is the CIA attempting this? So he says it's the CIA that's behind it. And so Pepe Escobar says the failed coup in Brazil is the latest CIA stunt, just as the country is forging stronger ties with the East. So we always have to remember this, that any government that decides to align itself with Russia and China, that decides to strengthen ties there, remember Brazil is the B in BRICS, that we can see this coup attempt as a challenge to that. And we know that Bolsonaro, despite whatever contradictions he had, and some people said, well, he wasn't necessarily against multipolarity, he didn't try to be hostile toward BRICS, for example. Well, he also kind of let Brazil's role in all of this die a lot, because he focused on this very narrow, hard right nationalism, which went in contravention to multipolarity, which went in contravention to the ability to cooperate with countries like Russia and China, like being a leader in the BRICS mechanism, because that was seen as like, oh, big bad globalization, right? But these are things that, despite whatever nationalism China and Russia supports for their own countries and sovereignty and self-determination, they always champion these institutions as critical. So that's the key difference between Bolsonaro, Putin, and Xi Jinping. And let's be honest, there's a lot more differences than that, but that's a major one between Bolsonaro and Lula, for example. So Pepe says that a former U.S. intelligence official has confirmed that the shambolic Maidan remix staged in Brasilia on January 8th was a CIA operation and linked to the recent attempts at a color revolution in Iran. On Sunday, alleged supporters of former right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro stormed Brazil's Congress, Supreme Court, and presidential palace, bypassing flimsy security barricades, climbing on roofs, smashing windows, destroying public property, including precious paintings, while calling for a military coup as part of a regime change scheme targeting elected President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. According to the U.S. source, the reason for staging the operation, which bears visible signs of hasty planning, now is that Brazil is set to reassert itself in global politics alongside fellow BRICS states, Russia, India, and China. That suggests CIA planners are avid readers of Credit Suisse strategist Zoltan Pozsar, formerly of the New York Federal Reserve. In his groundbreaking December 27th report titled War and Commodity Encumbrance, Pozsar states that the multipolar world is being built not by G7 heads of state, but by the G7 of the East, the BRICS heads of state, which is really a G5, but because of BRICS expansion, I took the liberty to round up. So what he means are reports that, and what he's referencing are reports that Algeria, Argentina, Iran have already applied to join BRICS, or rather its expanded BRICS Plus, with further interest expressed by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, Afghanistan, and Indonesia. The U.S. source drew a parallel between the CIA's Maidan in Brazil and a series of recent street demonstrations in Iran instrumentalized by the agency as part of a new color revolution drive. Quote, the CIA operations in Brazil and Iran parallel the operation in 2002 in Venezuela, which was highly successful at the start as rioters managed to seize Hugo Chavez. I mean, let's be honest here. When the so-called riots on January 6th in the United States occurred, they weren't trying to seize Joe Biden. Who knows if they were trying to seize anybody? There was some violence in it. Let me not say that no violence occurred on the Capitol building that day, January 6, 2021 in the United States. It did. And of course, that kind of thing is terrible and it really is dangerous. But at the same time, that violence was between these rioters, these stormers of the Capitol, and the federal security apparatus, right? That they all share the blame there. But here you had a very flimsy security situation, which unsurprising that Brazil would have maybe a rudimentary process to protect someone like Lula in its security forces, because the police are always more divided than, let's say, the military. But even both the military and the police in Brazil probably can, it's not like Venezuela, where the army in Venezuela is very much pro-Maduro, pro-party for socialism, the Venezuelan Party for Socialism, the PSUV. It's different in Brazil. So, of course, there's a flimsy security apparatus protecting Lula, and these forces were most likely trying to kidnap him. They wanted him gone. They wanted to oust him. So that's a legitimate coup. Regardless of how strange they looked in the Capitol when they were in the Congress building or the Supreme Court, there were forces in there likely trying to kidnap him. But here you have essentially the truth of the matter is that, yeah, there is concern among the real elite. So even if Biden is talking one way, you have the real elite, like in Wall Street, for example, the Federal Reserve, these major monopolies. They don't like to see someone like Lula come to power who says, we want to alleviate poverty in Brazil, and we also want to start reasserting leadership in this process of detaching from U.S. hegemony, the U.S. dollar, and of course, creating these multilateral institutions, these institutions of multipolarity, which can get that job done, or at least build up to that goal. And they don't like that. So enter the G7 of the East. Straussian neocons placed at the top of the CIA, irrespective of their political affiliation, are livid at the G7 of the East as the BRICS Plus configuration of the near future are fast moving out of the U.S. dollar orbit. John Bolton, who has publicized his interest in running for U.S. president, is now demanding the ouster of Turkey from NATO as the global South realigns rapidly with multipolar institutions. Russian Minister Sergei Lavrov and his new Chinese counterpart, Qin Gang, have just announced merging the China-driven Belt and Road Initiative and the Russian-driven Eurasian Economic Union. I didn't even know that, and that is huge. One thing that you'll notice in mainstream Western reports on Russia and China and the alliance, there's a lot of like, is this alliance that strong? This alliance has some disagreements. Even I was reading a Chinese journal that was talking about the Russia-China relationship, and even China acknowledged that, yeah, there could be some overlap between these integration projects, which could lead to some possible disagreement over which one is more important, for example, or which one should be kind of driving the integration process. There may be some contradiction, some competition, and some conflict there. Here, you're having Pepe Escobar say that actually they're trying to merge these projects together. So that contradiction itself is not even strong enough. So to divide them. So this relationship is just getting stronger and stronger. So this means that the largest 21st century trade, connectivity, and development project, the Chinese New Silk Road, is now even more complex and keeps expanding. This sets the stage for the introduction, already being designed at various levels, of a new international trading currency aimed at supplanting then replacing the US dollar. Apart from an internal debate among the BRICS, one of the key vectors of the discussion team set up between the EA, EU, and China. When concluded, these deliberations will be presented to BRI, EA, EU partner nations, and of course the expanded BRICS Plus. Lula at the helm in Brazil is in what is now his third non-successive presidential term, will offer a tremendous boost to BRICS. In the 2000s, side by side with Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Hu Jintao, Lula was a key conceptualizer of a deeper role for BRICS, including trading in their own currencies. BRICS as the new G7 of the East, as defined by Pozar, is beyond anathema, as much for Straussian neocons as for the neoliberals. The U.S. is being slowly but surely expelled from wider Eurasia by concerted actions of the Russia-China strategic partnership. Ukraine is a black hole where NATO faces humiliation that will make Afghanistan look like Alice in Wonderland, a feeble EU being forced by Washington to deindustrialize, and by U.S. liquefied natural gas at absurdly high cost, has no essential resources for the empire to plunder. So, this is the situation. Brazil falls within a larger context. This larger context is that the world is moving away from the United States, and Brazil is. Brazil is going to. Doesn't matter how divided the government is in Brazil. Doesn't matter, because the commander-in-chief in Brazil has a lot of power, and you saw that under Lula's administration when the BRICS was established. You saw Lula be able to carry that out even as other things might have been hampered, compromises with neoliberalism, etc. But nonetheless, the overall trajectory is moving away from the U.S. And now you have Ukraine is just, it's a disaster for the West, because it only exacerbates the decline. It exacerbates Europe's demise, which was coming anyway. Let's be honest here. Europe was always in a situation where it had to be dependent on something, dependent on Russia. So it's aimed to be more like the United States and to continue on with this colonial mentality and this imperial mentality. Was always going to be contradicted by a rising Russia and a rising China. And it was going to have to get closer to those two countries to maintain any kind of stability. Ukraine has blown the lid off of all of that completely. And so Ukraine is this black hole economically for Europe and also the United States, because the U.S. economy is not in good shape. The U.S. corporate and capitalist economy is not in good shape either. And so eventually something will give there. It's just that Europe is giving the United States a springboard from which to avoid the worst of it at this moment. But of course, we know here in the United States, if you live in the United States, you know that the worst of it is hitting you already, with massive inflation, rise in the cost of living, stagnant wages, so on and so forth. So geoeconomically, this leaves U.S.-dominated Western Hemisphere, especially energy-rich Venezuela, as a key target, and geopolitically, the key regional actor is Brazil. The neocon plays to pull all stops to prevent Chinese and Russian expansion in political influence in Latin America, which Washington, irrespective of international law and the concept of sovereignty, continues to call our backyard, or I would add, as Biden calls it, the front yard of the U.S. In times where neoliberalism is so inclusive that Zionists wear swastikas, the Monroe Doctrine is back and on steroids. I like that. All about the strategy of attention. Clues for a Maidan in Brazil can be obtained, for instance, at the U.S. Cyber Army Command at Fort Gordon, where it's no secret that the CIA deployed hundreds of assets across Brazil ahead of the recent presidential election, faithful to the strategy of tension playbook. CIA chatter was intercepted at Fort Gordon since mid-2022. The main theme then was the imposition of a widespread narrative that Lula could only win by cheating. A key target of the CIA operation was to discredit by all means the Brazilian electoral process, paving the way for a prepackaged narrative that is now unraveling. A defeated Bolsonaro fleeing Brazil and seeking refuge at former U.S. President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago mansion. Bolsonaro, advised by Steve Bannon, did flee Brazil, skipping Lula's inauguration, but because he's terrified he may be facing the slammer sooner rather than later. And by the way, he's in Orlando, not Mar-a-Lago. The icing on the stale Maidan cake was what happened this past Sunday, fabricating January 8th in Brasilia, mirroring the events of January 6, 2021 in Washington, and of course, imprinting the Bolsonaro-Trump link on people's minds. So I think this is important because Bolsonaro and Trump, well, A lot of people wanted to equate the two. A lot of this was narrative management. Bolsonaro represented his own kind of force, was a child of the oligarchy, of the dictatorship, a very specific historical circumstance. Donald Trump is more of a symptom of a broader disease, American disease, imperial disease. But the two only shared very, I feel like, um, um, you know, spurious connections ideologically. But when it came to this narrative management that Pepe is talking about, it's true. We saw Brazil's election be delegitimized. There was all this media chatter of Brazil's election process maybe being not so strong. And, it wasn't until it was pretty obvious that Lula was going to win anyway that the United States kind of did a 180. And I think the reason why the United States did a 180 is because it's in a bit of a weak point and is waiting for the right time. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter what, remember, it doesn't matter what the U.S. says. The U.S. can spew vile anti-Lula propaganda or not. Regardless, it matters what the U.S. does. And so I think all signs point to this being an operation, and that there needs to be, the U.S.'s imprint is always going to be on this, and there needs to be more investigation as to the credibility of that. But I think it's very well plausible. So the amateurish nature of the January 8th in Brasilia suggests CIA planners got lost in their own plot. The whole farce had to be anticipated because of Posar's report, which everyone who matters has read across the New York Beltway axis. What is clear is that for some factions of the U.S.'s powerful establishment, getting rid of Trump at all costs is even more crucial than crippling Brazil's role in BRICS. Plus, when it comes to the internal factors of Maidan in Brazil, borrowing from novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez, everything walks and talks like the chronicle of a coup foretold. It is impossible that the security apparatus around Lula could not have foreseen these events, especially considering the tsunami of signs on social networks. So there must have been a concerted effort to act softly without preventive big sticks, while just emitting the usual neoliberal babble. After all, Lula's cabinet is a mess, with ministers constantly clashing and some members supporting Bolsonaro even a few months ago. Lula calls it a national unity government, but it's more like a tawdry patchwork job. Brazilian analyst Quantum Bird, a globally respected physics scholar who has returned home after a long stint in NATO lands, notes how there are too many actors in play and too many antagonistic interests. Among Lula's ministers, we find Bolsonarists, neoliberal rentiers, climate interventionism converts, identity politics practitioners, and a vast fauna of political neophytes and social climbers, all well aligned with Washington's imperial interests. And I think that's true. There's no doubt about that. This is the case in a lot of different governments in Latin America that are moving left. Argentina has a big predicament itself. It has a very strong right wing. Governments, like Argentina, like Brazil, they're in a much harder situation politically. And, we talked about Haiti here last stream. And I just want to note that, I think it's totally necessary to defend Haiti and to call for the abolishment, the complete ridding of the occupation in Haiti by the UN and by the core group and by all imperialist interests led by the United States. We have to emphasize that. But I also think it's important to note that Brazil's government is by no means a socialist government. It is a government that has a socialist, or we could call more of a social democrat, but that leans socialist in Lula. But the government itself is by no means a socialist government. And so while Lula could surely probably do more in the diplomatic realm, he might be able to do more vocally, rhetorically. Unclear whether certain interests would allow for Lula to move on every single item that could be beneficial to, let's say, the people of Haiti or any other matter, right? Because unlike BRICS Plus, which has China and Russia and powerful forces behind it, which Brazil can align with and get some diplomatic, political, and economic protection from. Unfortunately, the question of Haiti really does hit right at the heart of U.S. imperialism and also the oligarchy in Brazil. and leads to difficult circumstances. So I think it's important to know also with Mexico too, Mexico's government is by no means a socialist government, no matter how progressive AMLO may be. AMLO himself has contradictions, but it's also a matter of what is the actual character of the state. And the actual character of the state in both countries, Brazil and Mexico, are nowhere near what, let's say, a Cuba is, or even a Venezuela, which has had multiple, in Nicaragua, multiple successive, strong electoral kind of takeovers of the state with strong leadership and a military that's on the side of the political party in power. No such thing exists in Mexico or Venezuela. So let's continue here. One plausible scenario is that powerful sectors of the Brazilian military at the service of the neocon think tanks plus global finance capital could not really pull off a coup, considering massive popular rejection had to settle for, at best, for a soft farce. That illustrates just how much this self-aggrandizing and highly corrupt military faction is isolated from Brazilian society. What is deeply worrying, as Quantum Bird notes, is that the unanimity in condemning January 8th from all quarters, while no one took responsibility, shows how Lula navigates virtually alone in a sea infested by sharpened corals and hungry sharks. Lula's position, he adds, decreeing a federal intervention all by himself without strong faces of his own government or relevant authorities, shows an impoverished, disorganized, and amateurish reaction. And all that, once again, after CIA-stoked militants have been organizing protests openly on social media for days. So, I don't know if I agree with Quantum Bird here. This is where I would differ. I would say that if you have a coup attempt happening, you got to crush it. You got to I mean, I have no qualms about that. Now, whether, I think there are situations where, crushing a coup may hurt you, or it may help you, or it may do somewhat of both, right? You could embolden some of these forces to want to take further action. But at the same time, what can happen when coups actually threaten the power and legitimacy of the state is that if you allow these forces to be absorbed and to be legitimized, they could very well take you down in legitimate ways. We saw this happen in Brazil through lawfare, where it was said that Dilma was corrupt, and there was a bogus corruption scandal labeled upon her, foisted upon her, and she was overthrown. So this is not new to Brazil, and so at this moment, this delicate moment, I don't necessarily agree that it's necessarily childish to do what Lula did. I think there are moments where, of course, you're going to defend your interests, and I think sometimes there's this like, oh, well, it's like January 6th and it's against civil liberties and all of this, and it's being used to strengthen the hand of the state. Literally, without breaking up these forces, you could face a very prolonged occupation. You have to stop this kind of activity, just like Iran has to stop the protests that they do when they turn violent. China had to stop the Hong Kong protests when they started, although China did it in a very, I think it has a lot of favorable conditions where most people in Hong Kong didn't agree with those protests anyway. So all those protests and the violence had to dissipate anyway, because people were not going to tolerate it for very much longer and sided with the police in Hong Kong. And so we can go on and on and on, but the point is that, yeah, you do have to have some kind of response to these kind of events, because color revolutions are dangerous. So the same CIA playbook, though, remains at work. It boggles the mind still how easy it is to subvert Brazil, one of the natural leaders of the global South. Attempted old school coups come regime change. Color revolution scripts will keep being played. Remember Kazakhstan early 2021 and Iran only a few months ago. As much as the self-aggrandizing faction of the Brazilian military may believe they control the nation, if Lula's significant masses hit the streets in full force against this January 8th farce, the army's impotence will be graphically imprinted. And since this is a CIA operation, the handlers will order their tropical military vassals to behave like ostriches. The future is ominous. The U.S. establishment will not allow Brazil, the BRICS economy with the best potential after China, to be back in business with full force and in sync with the Russia-China strategic partnership. Neocons and neoliberals, certified geopolitical jackals and hyenas, will get even more ferocious as the G7 of the East, Brazil included, moves to end the suzerainty of the US dollar as imperial control of the world vanishes. So, I thought that was a good piece to cover the Brazil situation because it really places Brazil in this broader focus. I think that's so important to do, this broader world situation, because I hear a lot of chatter on social media about, oh, well, Lula's turned more liberal. Lula's more neoliberal now. Lula's aligning with all these forces, these like anti-free speech forces, vaccines, blah, 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 without attention to what I think are the real core issues here, which is poverty, which Lula has been very strong about, which is trying to integrate Brazil's society, which has a lot of work to do there when it comes to indigenous peoples, a lot of emphasis on that, ending privatization, which leads to this massive poverty. And of course, what Pepe Escobar talks about here, integration, the integration of Brazil in this infrastructure of multipolarity where its economy is massive. It's one of the biggest economies in the world in real terms, but underdevelopment has kept it from being able to meet its potential. And a lot of that has to do with the neoliberal world order and how the United States has led much of that continent, but Brazil in particular, into a very difficult position, which it now seeks to get out of through mechanisms like BRICS Plus and the like. So that's the situation. Brazil, this coup attempt was very much a failure. You didn't see the government really intervene, like the military intervene on the side of it, because I think it was quite clear that this wasn't going to be successful, that the United States was not going to get what it wanted. The intelligence apparatus wasn't going to get what it wanted. And, it'll be interesting to see how things develop from here. Will there be momentum toward building toward new operations like this, or will Lula be able to consolidate his base, because it is a big base that Lula does have? Remember that it might be even bigger than before because a lot of forces saw Lula as the only candidate that could defeat someone like Bolsonaro. So we'll see how Lula da Silva, the Workers' Party, how they're able to consolidate their influence and their power as things transpire after a very strange beginning of another iteration of Lula da Silva and Brazil moving left in a massively changing world, a fast changing world where Brazil is a big part of the movement toward multipolarity. So that is that's the stories, guys. So look, I don't know what's going on with YouTube, because I was doing there was this massive improvement in the stream viewership on YouTube up until I came back from the New Year's kind of break that I took. So we'll see how things go here with streaming. I'll continue to stream consistently, but it's pretty rough. I was upward of like 600 to 1,000 people per stream. Now it's down to less than that. So it's a very interesting development. It's down, it's down by what? Cut that into threes, right? Down 300%. That's a lot. Thank you for the super sticker. I'm going to get to the super stickers and the chat super chats now. All right, to end the program. And you know what to do, guys. So I do have an announcement. Neisna won the strike, so my wife had a huge victory. She was like up all night because there were negotiations happening deep into the night with the hospitals, but the nurses won. So great news for Neisna, for nurses, for my wife in particular, who was a big part of that strike. An incredible effort, a lot of energy, a real strike, not these like fake, symbolic strikes, which are all about, like the fast food workers at CIU do that, where they're like, oh, we're walking out, but they're not really. This was a real strike, and they got what they wanted. They got concrete language about enforcing staffing ratios and mechanisms to enforce that, which was the big thing. And of course, they got wage increases. They didn't cut the health care again. So good stuff. Good stuff. So good times. So an interesting dichotomy here. My media work. We often talk about our different kinds of work, and this media work going through some weird bumps here. We'll see how things transpire into the new year, 2023. But an exciting kind of new development for her and for all of us, because their victory is a big one in a city like New York. Hospitals that are that concentrated in their capital and wealth, facing that and experiencing a defeat, no matter how granular in the broader scheme of things, still very major. So let me get into the super chats. The best way to support this work. I'm still, trying to build up. Tax season is upon us, and if you know anything about how creators or YouTube and all the ways, Patreon, all the ways we get income, it's untaxed. So tax season is always like, oh no, that's gonna be a big bill. But nonetheless, tax season's upon us. I have big plan. I want in the new year to definitely upgrade some equipment. I had a huge problem to begin this stream. Like, my computer froze up, and the song actually went a lot longer. I was only going to do it for 3 minutes, but I couldn't get to the StreamYard because my browser had frozen. So I need to update that big time. That's the big thing. And then, other updates will hopefully come after that. So the best way to support, all the links are in the description. Patreon.com/Dhaiphong. And you can also become a YouTube member as well, $5 a month. Patreon gives annual options in my tiers. And, there's Substack and there's other things as well. So I'm writing an article, actually. I'll probably cover it on the channel when it's done. I might submit it to Multipolarista and Multipolarista. Sorry, Ben. Geopolitical Economy Report, which I am serving as on the contributing editorial board. So, I may submit it there as well, and of course my Substack. And it'll be all about the I talk all about this Foreign Policy Magazine article I kind of briefly cited. And I talk about this preparation being done, even just in the realm of propaganda and in the realm of these think tanks and in the corporate media, of preparing for the next war. Literally, they're already preparing for Taiwan to a degree even larger than we could have expected. At this moment, where they're so caught up in Ukraine, now it's Taiwan and China, and they're making it very clear. So I'm writing about that, going through the people, the sources, the institutions, and that should be done hopefully in a couple of days. I'm hoping to get a draft done, start to really finish that thing up. So let's go through these chats, all right? So, and then we will finish up. So, hello everyone. First of all, hello to all the moderators. Hello to all the members. So, hi, Big Teal. Hello, Ware. Good evening to you. Thank you so much, None of Your Business, None OYB, for that super sticker, generous super sticker. Let's see. Thanks. Good to see you, Dinnerell member, YouTube member, talking about privatization here. Good point there. Thanks so much for being here. So let's keep it going. Keep it going. I had one person generously say that they'll edit out the theme song when the stream goes on replay. and that's great. And so I see Indie Left News here. Hi, thanks for making the live stream. And we are due for a collab. I've been terrible with everybody. I'm sorry, everybody on collaborating on live streams, and it's just because it's been kind of a crazy time with my wife striking, and I've kind of had to do more house stuff. But also, yeah, I've kind of put a lot into this program, and it's just taken so much time. So I do owe a lot of people. I owe JB over at RBN and his own channel. So I owe a good. There's probably more people than that. So I hate being that person because I always get frustrated when other people don't respond to me. So I know how that feels. But we'll get there. Hopefully soon. Anyone else? Let's see. Just moving up here. Seeing. Let's see. Okay. So probably not a lot because fewer viewers today. I thought I saw some. Caven said they want Riley back. Discriminatory measures targeting tourists from mainland China, Hong Kong, and Macau. Sorry, I just caught that. That's good. Good to, yeah, we could have Riley or someone else from Nodutdol. I know they like to get other people involved too. So could be him. It could be someone else. We had Janice before that. But we'll be collaborating in the future for sure. Perhaps next time I'll make it like a Patreon. I'm thinking about making like when I have guests on, a lot of people want to do questions for them. So I may do a segment where I take part of the interview with guests and I make it into a question. Like I'll have like, taking a few questions from guests, questions that I might filter them because some questions may not be ones that I want to ask, but I would use them. And that could be a way for you all to get some benefits from this, because I know I'm not able to do super chats or anything with guests usually because of the time. So that's an idea I've been having. I'm actually gonna probably write that down because I think it's a good idea. That I could implement in this new year. Let's see. Let's keep going here. Anyone else? I thought I saw maybe one or two other super chats or super stickers during Riley's conversation. So hello, Loa. Hello, Desert Mantis as well, who are also moderators of the channel, of the chat, I should say. All right. Yes, Megan, thank you so much for that super chat. Super chat with no comment. Thank you so much. And then here is, there was another one. Emblemed Fate. What's your opinion on great current African socialist parties? What do you think? And list some. Oh gosh. That's a good question. And, there's a Socialist Party of, I believe, Zambia, of Ghana. There's a few. Communist Party of Zimbabwe, but I'm not a big fan of the CP of Zimbabwe because they're a little too anti-ZANU for me. I support ZANU PF and land reform and national liberation. So there's the Kenyan Communist Party, which has some interesting work. They do a lot of cultural stuff like rap and hip hop, and they have a few members there. I think somebody just got killed by the Kenyan police in the Communist Party of Kenya. So there's just a few. Socialist Party of Zambia, Socialist Party of Ghana. There's Communist Party of Kenya. But yeah, there's also the NUMSA Union, which is affiliated, I believe, with the Socialist Workers Party in South Africa. But yeah, and they do some interesting work, but it's also different on the African continent. There's a lot of contradictions there and struggles. So yeah, that's as much of an answer as I'll give now, because unfortunately I haven't been focusing as much on the African continent as maybe I would like to. But those are some that you could look into. Thanks so much for that super chat, by the way. I think that might be it. Nope. Of course, JM, thanks so much for your membership and your continued support, super chats, etc. I believe there are a few of those here. So, yeah, it's been quieter, 200, 300 viewers now. It's down from the 600 to 1,000 that have been coming on. So something to really investigate. How you do that, I don't know. Thanks again, JM. So that does it for the super chats and the super stickers and all that good stuff. Someone said Arab Socialist Union. Oh, All Africa. How can I forget the All African People's Revolutionary Party? Yeah, I should. Oh, what was the gentleman's name? Was doing some really good. I think is he based in Guinea-Bissau? He was talking. I forget what he was talking about China. I was really liking what he had to say. I forget his name now, but how could I forget about the All African People's Revolutionary Party? You're right. That's my bad right there. Somebody said Li Jingjing. I want to collaborate with Li Jingjing very soon. We were actually joking about China and traveling there now that things have opened up since January 8th. Really want to get out there, guys. Really do. Big priority. Although Vietnam and Europe are also things that my wife and I want to go to Europe for like more of just a trip. But Vietnam and China are places I really want to get to for all purposes. Nadia says YouTube is obviously trying to kill all leftist channels. Look, I was experiencing that for a long time in the beginning too. And then I had this period of growth, and then I was like, oh, maybe this is going to be consistent. And then suddenly it was like, bam, kind of like moving backward a bit. And it's like, it's a different position to be in, to be like, wow, things are growing. And then, put all the brakes on and no idea why. You had this like YouTube wide view theft going on in the analytics of this thing. And then of course we've had this happening for so long. So you bring up a good point, Nadia. And so I was like, okay, maybe I can stay at a certain point. And then boom, it's like, wow, these viewers went somewhere. I haven't been doing anything really different. But YouTube said it's time to cap Danny. Maybe true. But one way I counter that is through collaborations. And so I'm really trying to hit people up. I need to do a military update on Ukraine during the month of February. I'm going to try to do like almost like a once a week guest. In that month, I want to try to have a guest on all things Ukraine proxy war leading to this anniversary, from people who are like the Duran, the Russia experts. I want to have like an economics of the proxy war with maybe Michael Hudson and Radhika Desai. So I want to definitely, I'll have Brian Berletic on again, so I want to, if these forces have time to collaborate next month, it's going to be a big month of collaborations because it's totally necessary. But that's one way that I've tried to, of when things like this happen, try to get around it. But there's not much else you can do. I mean, you can try all the tricks of the trade, and we are not individually more powerful than this corporation. That's for sure. But anyone who's been here, like Queer Black Socialistas, just enter the chat. Don't worry, it'll be on replay, so you can just rewind it back. I do not hide the streams afterward. I clip them later too, so although some streams I clip much later because I'm one guy, so it's hard to catch up. I have a lot of old streams I have to clip from very much still. Someone said, could you have Ting's Chalk VJ Prasad on the stream again? I think I haven't had Ting's on yet. I have had thought about that. I will a VJ I've had on. But yeah, definitely could do that, Christian. So yeah. Lois Socialista say, where in Europe? Oh God. We want to go to France. I don't know if that's gonna happen now. We definitely want to go to Greece. I think it may be Greece, Italy. We have to go to London because I have to see Carlos Martinez. Have to see him. He's come to the city once since we've known each other. This was back in 2019. No, 2018. Maybe early 2019. No, it was 2018. So he came to the city visiting some like distant cousin or close cousin, or I don't know, but it was a family member, and we were able to meet up for a little bit for like a lunch. But then we went to China in the delegation together. But surely I owe him a visit to London, and then he might want to go to Brussels because he can take a train, like a one train to Brussels. So maybe that, but Greece and Italy are in there just to get that Mediterranean vibe, the pretty sights, all that. So yeah, that's the thought for Europe. So I'm just looking through some of these chats, especially from the moderators, the members, but anyone. Oops, sorry. But yes, VJ definitely on the list as well. Christine Park, I know you said something about maybe views will go up. Not really. I wish. Yeah. All right, everyone. This is a wrap. So I'm gonna focus on this article, I think, for a little bit. My wife, starting tomorrow, she went on strike and then she came back to work tonight, and then she's off for like the next. I think I need a little bit of a break. I was thinking about coming back on Sunday. If Brian, I asked Brian for a military update, Brian Berletic, if he can do it. Maybe I will be back on Sunday to do that with him in the mid-morning time. If he's not, I don't know when I'll be back streaming. Maybe I will try. I have a lot I want to get to that I didn't get to cover today. But it may be a little bit. It may be early next week at some point. There's a lot there. I'm kind of working with the schedule here. But yeah. Someone say get Richard Medhurst on. I have had Richard Medhurst on. He's been on the channel before. You can catch that stream. Ooh, that was not too long ago either. That was within the last few months. I believe that was in October. So you can catch that. It's on the replay. Go to the live section. But yeah, no, I'll have him on again. I don't know how active he is right now. He might be on an extended break. I haven't seen him very active, but yeah, no, we'll collaborate again. Richard's good people. So Grinning Guy says, F me, just got here wrapping up. Yes, but there's the replay. So there's a liking. If you just got here, liking, subscribing, hitting the notifications bell, you might not have got notified, or maybe you're doing something else and didn't have the time. The replays will always be here, so do not worry. Clips also will be available at some point. So yeah. David Harbin says get Scott Ritter on the show. Had him just this month, I believe. Was that early this month? No, it was late last year. So I believe a couple weeks ago. So you can catch that replay. I was with Dan Kovalik. So December 23rd, actually, so more than 3 weeks ago. But yeah, Scott Ritter will be on the show again. Probably I might ask him next month for the anniversary of the Ukraine war. So thanks everyone who said props to my wife. Yeah, no, she's always been at least for as long as I've known her, and before that, very committed revolutionary, communist, and now she's a part of a big labor struggle. And she's getting into this in the nursing arena, which was what her plan was. And so what better way to begin? She's been thank you, Gamer for Life. What better way to do that than to become again in the rank and file and end up in a situation where a contract is expiring, where there's a lot of struggle in that workplace and a lot of tension, and neoliberalism has really done a number on the hospitals and the working conditions of nurses. And so she was in a powder keg and got to not just experience a strike, but be a big part of getting it together. And props to her too. Her floor, her unit was consistently one of the most engaged, both in terms of getting out to the picket line and also just being a part of the activities. And it's because a lot of that's because of her. So good stuff. Some people are bringing up. Yeah. Jackson Hinkle one time said that nurses aren't workers or something. Big Teal says she adores Richard. Sorry, I put that up. But it's great to have some of these small victories, big victories. I think there's a big victory, but in the grand scheme of things, any victory must be celebrated. And yeah, so good stuff, everyone. Let's do this. Yes, Gamer for Life says 2 years sober from alcohol. Congratulations, Gamer for Life. As a therapist, I gotta say, salute to you. It's amazing stuff. All right, amazing stuff. Christine interviewed my wife. I would love her to get on the media scene with me. That would be really fun. Now, will she? I don't know. She's not a big fan of this stuff. She's not much of a social media person, but let's see how things go as she develops more. She's only been there for like 8-9 months. Let's see how things go as she develops more of a public persona. She's organizing within a party as well, and she's managing what always happens, which is like, how open do you want to be? How not open do you want to be in certain arenas? Yeah. Yeah. Don't make her lose her RN. No. That's why. No names here. No nothing. Anyway. All right, guys. All right, gals. All right. Everyone on the spectrum of things, gender, otherwise. Yeah, there's a fly in my apartment. Gross. Good night. It's 11 o'clock out here. Someone said get on Gonzalo Lira's roundtable. I'd love to. That would probably be great for my channel to talk about this stuff. Perhaps. Maybe I could get a connection to help me out with that. But good ideas. Keep throwing the ideas my way. Send me a message. sign up on Patreon. DM me there. Patreon.com/DannyHaiphong is a great way to just always connect. You can connect with me better there. Helps me boundary up things, but there are other ways you can send me messages as well. Not just through the chat. I think my Instagram, if you follow me there, you can send me DMs. I look at those. So Danny_Haiphong. You can find a way to get to me. It's just, I try to keep boundaries as much as I can. But, I'm always open to suggestions. And I try to keep those who are contributing financially a priority to actually listening to this, but actually trying to incorporate them if they're a possibility. So good night, everyone. Good night. Take care. Take good care. And Morpheus said, are you Asian mix? I am multiracial Asian. Yes. Vietnamese, Chinese, likely, and Irish, German, blah, blah, blah. It's a bunch of different things. That's me. Friday the 13th is tomorrow. Ugh. Have a great evening, everyone. I will let you know when I'm back. All right. It might be through the weekend, maybe Sunday, maybe not, maybe Monday. Monday's tough. I have an evening therapy session I gotta do that makes it hard to get on in the evenings. If not, then though, I'll find a way Tuesday. But thanks everyone for watching. Salute. Be well. I'll be back soon. Bye-bye.